Silence in a public institution is a heavy burden, and tonight, the bill for decades of secrecy has finally come due at Windsor Castle. This is not a routine health update or a polished press release. It is the moment the most carefully controlled institution in Britain admits it has been hiding how close it came to losing its emotional center. Behind those heavy oak doors, a king and his heir stand side by side, finally realizing that the silence they maintained wasn't just privacy. It was a strategic error that allowed conspiracy theories to rot the crown's foundations from the inside out. This wasn't transparency. It was the truth being dragged out at the last possible moment because the palace machine was more afraid of the reality than of the scandal itself. For years, the monarchy functioned as a perfect stage where every crack was hidden behind oil paintings and rehearsed smiles. But recent leaks have torn the velvet curtain wide open. What was once managed as a planned and successful surgery has been exposed as something far more dangerous, forcing a king who lived his whole life by protocol to finally drop the mask. Charles has realized that you don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing, and the world has noticed that the palace was more interested in managing optics than in the basic humanity of its members. The institution reached its breaking point when it could no longer control the narrative, and the mask of invincibility finally slipped away. In the dim light of his private study, Charles made a confession to William that no script could ever capture, admitting that the system had reached a point where it was hiding how close it came to losing the one person who makes it feel human. He looked at his son and acknowledged that their attempts to control reality had failed, and that by labeling difficult truths as privacy, they had created a trust crisis that nearly destroyed the institution. It was a realization that silence in a family is one thing, but silence in a public institution is a weapon that eventually turns on the one holding it. He admitted that the palace had tried to own the story, but in doing so, they almost lost the trust of the people they serve. The decision to declare no more hiding is an institutional reset, a moment where Charles chose his family's survival over the rigid court advisors who wanted to maintain the illusion of a fairy tale. He understood that Kate's honest vulnerability in her 94-second video did more for the monarchy than 1,000 cold palace statements ever could. This wasn't just a health update. It was a confession that the monarchy can no longer pretend that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. If a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, it reveals a fundamental problem within the machine that governs their lives. Now, as they stand at this crossroads, the king knows that the monarchy is facing a survival test that goes beyond individual illness. Every cancelled meeting and every faked photo has led them here, to a place where only raw honesty can rebuild the bridge to a skeptical public. The monarchy doesn't just manage feelings, it manages perception. And that is exactly where the crisis began when they tried to control reality itself. Charles has finally admitted that if the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched its members suffer in real time, it must stop pretending it is invincible. To understand the gravity of Charles's confession, we must revisit the suffocating silence that preceded it, the months when the Princess of Wales simply vanished from the face of the earth. It began with a clinical, almost robotic statement in January about a planned and successful abdominal surgery, a phrase designed to project stability while hiding a growing storm. But you don't keep a future queen hidden for 100 days without the world beginning to ask questions that the palace wasn't prepared to answer. The silence wasn't a shield. It became a vacuum that every conspiracy theory and digital whisper rushed to fill, turning a private medical matter into a global crisis of trust. The turning point that signaled the palace machine was losing its grip occurred when Prince William abruptly cancelled his attendance at a major memorial service for his godfather, citing personal reasons just 45 minutes before it began. In the hyper-controlled world of royalty, a future king doesn't just walk away from a front-row seat without a catastrophic reason, and that moment of panic shattered the illusion that everything was under control. The palace insisted on privacy, but to the public, it felt like a desperate attempt to manage reality itself, a strategy of panic management disguised as dignity. Then came the Mother's Day photo, a digital disaster that proved the crown's PR machine had reached its breaking point. When global news agencies issued a kill notice on the image because it had been faked, the mask didn't just slip, it was torn off, exposing a system so desperate to project a business-as-usual narrative that it resorted to manipulation. Charles watched from the sidelines as his daughter-in-law was forced to take the blame for an institutional failure, a moment that insiders say began the internal fight over whether the palace should continue to lie or finally start telling the truth. Behind the heavy gates, the atmosphere had shifted from protective to combative, with whispers leaking from the hospital and hallways that it's worse than they are saying. Reports of an internal email with the subject line, "She deserves more than silence," began to circulate, highlighting a deep rift between the old guard advisors and a king who was beginning to see the human cost of the palace's secrecy. Charles realized that his heir was being crushed under the weight of protecting a secret that was already leaking through the cracks, and that the everything is fine narrative was actually making the situation far more dangerous for Kate's recovery. The king saw what the cameras never could, the toll that months of privacy were taking on a woman who was fighting for her life while being treated as a prop for the monarchy's stability. He realized that the palace was treating a human tragedy like a PR problem to be solved with polished lines and fake reassurances, while the person at the center was slipping away. This realization is what led to the late-night confrontation where the king finally decided that the script had to be rewritten, because silence in a public institution isn't just a strategy. It's a confession that you have lost control of the truth. The atmosphere inside the palace during those weeks was one of silent warfare, a collision between those who served the institution and those being broken by it. For the courtiers in gray suits, Kate was a central pillar of the brand that had to be maintained at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing the person behind the title. But as leaks from the London clinic began to whisper of unexpected complications, the carefully managed facade started to crumble under the weight of its own lies. The machine was operating on an outdated manual of secrecy, failing to realize that in the age of instant information, silence isn't a sanctuary. It's a target for every skeptic watching from the outside. Prince William found himself at the epicenter of this earthquake, torn between his duty to the crown and his desperate need to protect his wife. Insiders describe a prince becoming increasingly disillusioned with the system he is destined to lead, watching as staff prioritized optics over the fragile reality of a mother recovering from a devastating diagnosis. The tension reached a boiling point over a leaked internal communication that simply stated, "She deserves more than silence." This wasn't just a memo. It was an admission that the palace's strategy of clinical detachment was actively harming the emotional core of the family and creating a rift that no PR spin could fix. While the courtiers were busy drafting vague reassurances, King Charles was undergoing his own quiet transformation, driven by a shared experience of human vulnerability. Having faced his own cancer diagnosis, the king began to see the palace machine for what it truly was, a cold apparatus that valued the survival of the institution over the survival of the individual. His private visits to Kate's bedside weren't just about family comfort. They were a first-hand look at the toll that institutional gaslighting takes on a person in pain. He saw a woman being asked to perform stability while her world was collapsing, and he decided that the protocol of silence was fundamentally wrong. The moment Charles decided to break the machine was a historic shift in the power dynamic of the monarchy. He reportedly held a late-night meeting where he overruled his most senior advisors, effectively telling them that the old ways of hiding were dead if they meant living a lie that threatened to destroy his family. When a man born into protocol says enough, it signifies that the institution has reached its absolute breaking point. He chose Kate over the machine, realizing the monarchy's only chance for survival was to stop managing the perception and start telling the truth. By choosing vulnerability over the mask of invincibility, Charles wasn't just saving a princess. He was attempting to save the crown from its own toxic culture of secrecy. He was finally admitting that the institution can bleed, and that pretending otherwise was a fairy tale that no one believed anymore. This internal rebellion was the catalyst for the no more hiding directive that would eventually change the script of the monarchy forever. The king realized that a monarchy that hides its humanity eventually loses its reason to exist, and that honesty was the only currency that could still buy the public's trust. The failure of the palace's official statements was more than just a technical PR error. It was the total collapse of a mindset that prioritized brand preservation over human existence. For decades, the monarchy operated on the never explain, never complain mantra, a strategy designed to keep the institution on a pedestal, detached from the messy realities of life. However, when Kate's 94-second video appeared, it effectively detonated that entire structure. She wasn't sitting in a gilded room with blue ribbons. She was on a plain wooden bench, surrounded by nature, speaking about cancer as a mother and a wife rather than a royal icon. This raw sincerity exposed the cold, soulless nature of the previous, successful abdominal surgery updates, branding them as prime examples of institutional gaslighting. As the king witnessed the global reaction to that video, he realized a bitter truth. His own PR machine had become the family's greatest enemy. The advisors in gray suits, who always prioritized stability, had inadvertently created an environment where the truth was treated as a threat. Charles saw that by trying to manage Kate's pain through clinical, detached text, they had robbed her of the public's natural empathy. His confession to William that night was an admission that the era of the traditional palace press release is dead. Those statements no longer protect the crown. They only erode the public's trust. Kate's video wasn't just a medical update. It was a media revolution that forced the monarchy to shed its mask of invincibility and become human. The shift from brand to human is a painful but necessary survival tactic. Charles told William that continuing to use distant, mechanical language was a form of reputational suicide in the digital age. He realized that the public no longer demands a perfect queen or a flawless king. They want people they can relate to in their weakest moments. The 94-second video did what thousands of speeches could not. It created an invisible bond between the people and the throne through shared suffering. This was the moment the king decided that from now on, the truth would be their only weapon, no matter how ugly or shocking it might be, because a monarchy that cannot feel pain is a monarchy that has lost its soul. In their intense private dialogue, Charles dissected why their previous strategies failed so miserably. They lacked compassion. They were written by people who had never faced the fear of death or the collapse of family trust. When they labeled Kate's disappearance as privacy, they forgot that the privacy of a public figure is only valid when it isn't used to hide internal panic. Charles admitted that the rigidity of palace protocols had turned a personal health matter into a constitutional crisis. He demanded that William vow never to let the machine control their narrative again, because the price of prolonged silence is absolute isolation from the hearts of the people. Ultimately, the legacy of that 94-second video is that it reset the foundations of the modern monarchy. It proved that in a world of fake news and conspiracy theories, sincere vulnerability is the strongest shield. King Charles, in his emotional confession, affirmed that Kate saved the Vong True by breaking its greatest rule, the rule of absolute secrecy. From that moment, no more hiding became more than a PR slogan. It was an acknowledgement that the crown only has value when it rests on the head of a real human being who is honest with themselves and the people they serve. The king understood that to keep the audience's loyalty, they didn't need perfection. They needed the truth. The confession shifted from the clinical details of illness to a far more haunting subject: the shadows falling over the next generation, a phenomenon we must call the era of the gilded orphans. Charles admitted to William that while they were busy building fortresses of secrecy to protect the crown, they were inadvertently creating high-security bunkers that were starving their children of their emotional roots. These children live under roofs worth millions, adorned with titles and surrounded by staff, yet they are arguably the poorest in the world when it comes to the currency of genuine family connection. The king's voice grew heavy as he confessed that the palace's obsession with privacy had turned their homes into gilded cages where the warmth of a grandparent or the chaos of a cousin is replaced by a rigid, choreographed schedule. The king expressed a terrifying fear that by the time George, Charlotte, and Louis are old enough to understand their heritage, the family tree will have been pruned so severely that there will be no branches left for them to lean on. He looked at William and forced him to acknowledge the pattern of exclusion that has defined their recent history: the estrangement of Harry, the exile of the Markles, and the quiet departure of loyal pillars who simply couldn't survive the palace's cold atmosphere. Charles warned that if the no more hiding policy isn't implemented with a focus on healing, they are teaching the royal children that family members are merely characters in a script who can be written out the moment they stop serving the narrative. It is a heartbreaking reality that these children are being raised in a world where cutting people off is normalized as a form of protection. Charles confessed that the palace machine had tried to curate a perfect, untainted childhood for the young royals, but in doing so, they had manufactured a hollow existence. You cannot curate the soul, and you certainly cannot replace the unconditional love of a grandfather or an uncle with a polished PR statement. He admitted that every time the palace chose to hide a crisis or isolate a family member, they were effectively deleting a piece of the children's identity, leaving them as prince and princess of a kingdom that is increasingly empty of real people. The most dangerous lesson a child can learn is that human relationships are disposable based on institutional convenience. Charles pleaded with William to recognize that by isolating the family to save the brand, they have created a spiritual starvation within their own walls. He noted that while the public sees the perfection of the balcony appearances, the reality behind the gates is a crushing silence where empty guest houses serve as monuments to their inability to maintain a home. The king admitted that the everything is fine narrative was a lie they told themselves while the children's support system was systematically dismantled by court advisors who valued optics over blood. As the confession reached its emotional peak, Charles made it clear that no more hiding must also mean no more excluding. He told William that they cannot keep building walls and calling it security when those same walls are what prevent the grandchildren from knowing the warmth of a unified family. The silence at the holiday table and the missing cousins in the hallways are not signs of dignity. They are the sounds of a family dying from the inside out. This was the most painful part of the dialogue, as it forced the future king to confront the possibility that in their desperate quest to save the monarchy, they might be sacrificing the very humanity of the children who are meant to inherit it. The confession took a darker, more personal turn when the conversation shifted to the presence of Prince Harry and the heavy, invisible wall that was built to keep him away from Kate during her most vulnerable hours. Charles admitted to William that the decision to bar Harry from seeing his sister-in-law was not a petty act of revenge, but a clinical necessity for the survival of Kate's peace. He confessed that the palace had reached a state of zero trust, where the risk of a private conversation ending up as a chapter in a future memoir or a scene in a documentary was simply too high to ignore. For a family in crisis, a leak isn't just a PR problem. It is a violation of the soul, and Charles admitted that he could no longer gamble with Kate's emotional safety just to maintain the appearance of family unity. The king looked at his son and acknowledged the agonizing reality that Harry is no longer viewed as a brother or a son by the institution, but as a high-level informant whose loyalties belong to a different brand. Charles confessed that every time the Sussexes spoke of their truth, they were effectively selling the family's intimacy, and he could not allow that transaction to happen at Kate's bedside. He admitted that the no more hiding policy meant finally being honest about the fact that the rift is not a temporary misunderstanding, but a permanent structural failure. The king confessed that he had to be the one to enforce the distance, acting as the grim gatekeeper, so that William wouldn't have to bear the burden of being the brother who turned his back. There was a profound sadness in the king's voice as he spoke about the spiritual surgery required to cut a limb to save the body. He told William that the hardest part of the no more hiding directive was admitting that the family they once were is gone, replaced by a defensive unit that must exclude its own blood to prevent further hemorrhage. Charles admitted that the palace machine had tried to soften the blow of Harry's brief UK visit with vague statements, but the reality was a total lockdown. He confessed that he saw the anger in William's eyes and validated it, admitting that the palace's previous attempts to force a reconciliation were a mistake that only led to more betrayal. The king revealed that the ultimate reason Harry was kept away was the fear of emotional contamination. During a recovery from a diagnosis as serious as cancer, the environment must be sterile, not just physically but psychologically. Charles admitted that Harry's presence brings a noise of drama, lawsuits, and accusations that Kate's system simply could not handle. He confessed that he chose his daughter-in-law's recovery over his son's desire for a photo op, realizing that the monarchy's future depends on the woman who actually stayed and did the work, not the one who left and criticized it from afar. As the confession deepened, Charles spoke about the cost of this isolation, admitting that it is a tragedy that will haunt him until his final days. He told William that while no more hiding means telling the truth about Kate, it also means telling the truth about the irreparable damage caused by Harry's choices. He admitted that the palace can no longer afford the luxury of hope when it comes to the Sussexes. They must operate on the reality of the threat. This part of the confession was a formal end to the era of keeping a door open, as Charles admitted that for Kate to heal, that door had to be locked and the key turned from the inside. The confession reached its most solemn moment when William, the man destined to wear the weight of the crown next, stood before his father and made a vow that would effectively end the centuries-old architecture of royal secrecy. Charles looked at his son and saw not just a prince, but a man who had been forged in the fires of personal trauma and institutional betrayal, and who was now ready to dismantle the very system that had once tried to break his mother. William's vision for the monarchy is not one of gilded isolation, but of radical transparency. A vow that the gray suits will never again be allowed to trade the family's humanity for a hollow sense of stability. He admitted to his father that the days of the silent, untouchable monarch are over, and that if the crown is to survive the digital age, it must be willing to bleed in public. This was the moment William confronted the ghost of Diana within the walls of Windsor, telling Charles that he would not allow the same clinical indifference that haunted his mother's life to claim Kate's future. He confessed that for years, he had played along with the palace's scripts, believing that silence was a form of protection, only to realize that it was actually a form of abandonment. William's vow is a tectonic shift in royal philosophy. He is choosing a monarchy that prioritizes the mental and physical health of its members over the ancient protocols of the court. He made it clear that his reign would be defined by a human-first policy, where the Princess of Wales is treated as a partner in leadership, not a sacrificial asset to be managed by advisors who have never known the visceral fear of a hospital waiting room. The heir to the throne admitted that the recent crisis had been a baptism of fire that revealed the true fragility of their position. He told Charles that they can no longer afford to be a family of phantom appearances and faked photographs. They must be a family of substance that speaks the truth even when the truth is terrifying. William's vision is to strip away the layers of institutional gaslighting that have defined royal PR for generations, replacing it with a bond of trust that is earned through honesty. He confessed that he is tired of the business-as-usual lies that have poisoned their internal relationships, and he is ready to lead a monarchy that is comfortable with its own vulnerability, recognizing that Kate's illness has done more to humanize the crown than 1,000 years of tradition. The burden of the heir is now a dual responsibility: to protect the legacy of the past while aggressively reforming the culture of the future. William told his father that he is prepared to be the terminator of the old guard, ensuring that the advisors who manipulated the narrative during Kate's absence are removed from positions of influence. He admitted that the monarchy has been a slave to its own mystery for too long, and that the only way to prevent the children from becoming gilded orphans is to create an environment where the truth is the oxygen of the house. This was not just a son listening to his father. It was a future king taking command of the narrative, vowing that the era of hiding is officially dead, and that the new script will be written in the language of the heart, not the manual of the court. As the late-night meeting drew to a close, William's final vow was one of absolute protection for Kate, making it clear that her health and her truth are sacrosanct and non-negotiable. He told Charles that the palace machine will never again be allowed to put a kill notice on their family's dignity. The king listened as his son defined a new moral compass for the Vong Tru, one that replaces the cold mask of duty with the warm light of reality. This was the ultimate realization of the no more hiding directive, a monarchy that survives not because it is perfect, but because it is brave enough to be real. William has decided that if the world is going to watch them, they will see a family that is united by truth, not a brand held together by secrets. The most profound transformation in this entire saga is not the king's diagnosis or the prince's vow, but the quiet, calculated rise of Kate from a victim of institutional secrecy to the primary architect of a new royal era. Charles admitted to William that for years, the palace had treated Kate as a perfect asset, a woman whose primary role was to look flawless in photographs and follow the script without question. But the crisis of the last few months has revealed that she is much more than a silent partner. She is the only reason the monarchy still holds a thread of relevance in the modern world. The king confessed that while the gray suits were panicking over leaks and PR disasters, Kate was the one who understood that the only way to save the crown was to humanize it, effectively staging a soft coup against the old guard from her hospital bed. Charles revealed that the 94-second video Kate released was her decision alone, a moment where she took back her voice after years of being muffled by the palace machine. He admitted that the advisors wanted a formal statement, a cold and clinical announcement that would have kept her at a distance from the public. But Kate refused, choosing instead to sit on a bench in the cold, showing her vulnerability to millions. The king confessed to William that in that moment, Kate became the most powerful person in the family, because she realized what the men in suits never could. That truth is more magnetic than perfection. She stopped being a victim of the media and became the director of her own story, forcing the institution to follow her lead or face extinction. There is a terrifying realization in the king's confession, that the monarchy has become dangerously dependent on Kate's personal popularity. Charles admitted that without her, the Vong Tru is just a collection of old buildings and expensive jewelry. She is the emotional glue that keeps the public invested in their survival. He told William that the no more hiding policy is essentially Kate's legacy, a new operating system that she installed to prevent the monarchy from becoming a soulless museum. The king confessed that he had spent his life trying to modernize the institution through policy and environmentalism. But Kate did it in 94 seconds by simply being honest about her pain. She has moved from being a prop for the stability of the crown to being the prototype for how a 21st century queen must lead. The king's confession touched on the quiet empress energy that Kate has begun to project, a power that doesn't need a crown to command absolute respect. Charles admitted that he saw a change in Kate during their private lunches at Windsor, a new steeliness in her eyes and a refusal to play the role of the obedient daughter-in-law any longer. She has demanded a total restructuring of how her office operates, ensuring that her humanity is never again sacrificed for a PR cycle. The king confessed that he feels a sense of relief in handing over this no more hiding directive to her and William, recognizing that Kate's instinct for truth is the only thing that can protect the children from the toxic culture of secrecy that once destroyed Princess Diana. As the dialogue neared its end, Charles made a final, startling admission, that Kate has effectively reset the monarchy's moral compass. He told William that the palace can no longer hide behind privacy when the public expects authenticity, and that Kate is the one who will enforce this new standard. She is no longer just the wife of the heir. She is the guardian of the monarchy's soul. The king admitted that if the world still loves them, it is because they see Kate's courage reflected in the crown. This was the ultimate rise of the princess. A woman who survived a media storm, a health crisis, and institutional betrayal, and emerged not as a victim, but as the woman who saved the Vong Tru from itself. As the dawn breaks over the gray spires of Windsor, the echoes of this late-night confession signal the final, irrevocable end of the old world. King Charles and Prince William have not just exchanged words. They have signed the death warrant of a centuries-old architecture built on shadows and clinical indifference. The directive of no more hiding is the monarchy's last will and testament to a digital age that no longer accepts the never-explained mantra as a virtue. By choosing the raw, bleeding truth over the polished lies of the gray suits, the king has ensured that his greatest legacy will not be his policies or his environmentalism, but his courage to be human when the institution demanded he be a statue. The mask has not just slipped. It has been discarded in favor of a reality where the crown is a burden shared with the public, not a secret kept from them. This monumental shift represents a total restructuring of the royal soul, where the survival of the family is finally recognized as the only way to ensure the survival of the state. Charles has admitted that the everything is fine narrative was a poison that nearly killed the very thing it was meant to protect. In the quiet aftermath of this confrontation, the future of the monarchy looks fundamentally different. It is a house where the guest rooms will no longer be empty monuments to estrangement, and where the truth is no longer a threat to be managed by advisors. The king has handed the keys of the narrative to William and Kate, recognizing that their vulnerability is the only shield strong enough to withstand the scrutiny of a world that has seen too much to believe in fairy tales anymore. The era of the gilded orphans has been declared over before it could fully take root, as the king's confession serves as a protective barrier around the next generation. By vowing that George, Charlotte, and Louis will grow up in a house of honesty, Charles and William are ensuring that the children's identity is built on the firm ground of family connection rather than the shifting sands of PR strategy. The silence that once haunted the hallways of the palace has been replaced by a new, transparent language that allows for pain, for recovery, and for the simple reality of being a family in crisis. This is the ultimate victory of the no more hiding policy, a monarchy that is no longer a slave to its own mystery, but a family that is brave enough to exist in the light. As we close this investigation into the collapse of the final bridge, the message to the world is clear. The British monarchy has survived its greatest modern crisis by embracing the one thing it feared most, the truth. While critics may still attack their vulnerability and skeptics may question their motives, the undeniable reality is that the crown is now resting on a foundation of genuine human experience. Kate's rise as the guardian of the monarchy's soul and William's vow to be the terminator of the old guard have created a vong tru that is finally ready for the 21st century. The drama is not over, but the script has been rewritten by the people living it, and for the first time in history, the audience is seeing the real faces behind the titles. The final judgment now rests with you, the public who has watched this drama unfold from across the gates. Do you believe this radical honesty is a sign of a monarchy that has finally evolved? Or is it a desperate survival tactic from an institution that has run out of secrets? The palace guest house may be dark, but the lights in the family quarters are finally on, revealing a truth that no Netflix script could ever capture. As Doria Raglan drove toward her peace and Kate walked through her woods, they both proved that in the end, the only empire worth building is the one built on the soul. The show is not cancelled. It has simply become real.